It was a bright Friday morning when 5 friends Jake, Lisa, Matt, Sarah, and Emily set out on a road trip to a remote cabin in the mountains. The cabin belonged to Jake's uncle, who had offered it to them for the weekend as a getaway from the hustle and bustle of city life. Jake, the adventurous leader of the group, was excited about the trip. Lisa, his girlfriend, was looking forward to some quality time with her friends in nature. Matt, the jokester, had packed a cooler full of drinks and snacks. Sarah, the cautious one, had double-checked the cabin's location and their route multiple times. Emily, the free spirit, had her camera ready to capture every moment. The drive started off smoothly. They played their favorite road trip songs, shared stories, and laughed as they cruised along the highway. The GPS directed them to a scenic route that wound through picturesque landscapes, and they eagerly followed the path. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the horizon, they turned onto a narrow road that led into a dense forest. The GPS assured them it was a shortcut, and Jake, eager to reach the cabin before dark, took the turn without hesitation. The forest road was beautiful but eerie, with tall trees casting long shadows. The air grew cooler, and a thick fog began to roll in. They chatted less, the atmosphere inside the car becoming more subdued. After about an hour of driving, Jake frowned at the GPS. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "We should have reached the cabin by now." Lisa glanced at the screen. "Maybe we missed a turn." "No, I've been following it exactly," Jake replied. Sarah, checking her phone, noticed it had lost signal. "Guys, I don't have any service." Matt tried to lighten the mood. "Relax, it's just part of the adventure. We'll find it." But as they continued driving, the same landmarks seemed to appear over and over. A twisted tree, a rusted road sign, and a fallen log. They passed them repeatedly. The road seemed to loop endlessly. Panic began to set in. Emily, peering out the window, gasped. "Did anyone else see that?" "See what?" Jake asked, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "A figure." "Standing by the road," Emily whispered. They all turned to look, but saw nothing. Matt laughed nervously. "You're just seeing things." But then they heard it, a faint, eerie sound, like distant whispering. The radio, which had been playing music, now emitted only static interspersed with unintelligible voices. Jake decided to pull over and check the map. "Let's take a break and figure this out." They got out of the car, the fog swirling around them. The air was thick with tension. Lisa pointed to the road. "Look at these symbols." Strange symbols were etched into the asphalt, glowing faintly in the dim light. They looked ancient, like runes from a forgotten language. Sarah, who had studied folklore, shivered. These looked like protective symbols, or warnings. Deciding to press on, they got back in the car. As they drove, they encountered more unsettling sights. A hitchhiker appeared out of the fog, waving them down. Jake slowed the car, but as they approached, the figure vanished. "Did that just happen?" Matt asked, his voice shaky. "Let's just keep moving," Jake said, his face pale. The road seemed to stretch endlessly. Hours passed, but it felt like days. They passed abandoned vehicles, their doors open, as if the occupants had fled in a hurry. The whispering grew louder, filling the car with a chilling sense of dread. Fatigue and fear began to wear on them. Arguments broke out. "We should have stayed home," Sarah cried. "This was a stupid idea." "Stop blaming Jake," Lisa snapped. "We're all in this together." Emily, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke. "What if this road is some kind of trap? Maybe it's not about where we're going, but what we need to do to leave." Jake nodded. "Maybe we need to solve a riddle or confront something." Determined to find answers, they pulled over again. Emily suggested they look for clues in the car and along the roadside. As they searched, they found a diary in one of the abandoned cars. It belonged to a man named Daniel, who had also been trapped on the road. The diary entries were desperate. Daniel had written about the symbols and the strange occurrences. His last entry mentioned a clearing with a large stone marked with similar symbols, which he believed was the key to escaping. "Let's find that stone," Jake said, hope rekindling in his eyes. They drove on, searching for the clearing. The road seemed to fight them, with the fog growing thicker and the whispers turning into disembodied screams. But finally, they saw a break in the trees leading to a clearing. In the center stood a large stone covered in glowing symbols. As they approached, the temperature dropped and shadows flitted around them. "We need to solve this," Sarah said, studying the symbols. "Maybe it's a puzzle." Emily, recalling the diary, suggested they replicate the symbols in the dirt around the stone. They worked quickly, carving the symbols with sticks. As they completed the last symbol, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The ground shook, and the fog swirled violently. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The fog lifted, the whispers ceased, and the road ahead was clear. Relief washed over them as they got back into the car and drove. The road no longer looped, and soon they saw the familiar landmarks of the main highway. They had escaped the Unending drive. Back in the city, they shared their story with disbelief and caution, warning others to avoid the forest road. The experience had bonded them in ways they never imagined, and they knew they would never forget the road to nowhere. But deep down, they wondered, was it truly over? Or had they just been given a temporary reprieve? The symbols and whispers lingered in their minds, a haunting reminder of the nightmare they had endured. Jack was a seasoned trucker, accustomed to the solitude and long hours that came with the job. He had been driving freight across the country for over 2 decades. His favorite route was a quiet, almost deserted highway that cut through the heart of the desert. The road, known as Route 66 Billion, was peaceful, and he enjoyed the calm it offered during his nightly hauls. On one particularly clear night, Jack set out on his usual route. The sky was studded with stars, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the desert landscape. As he drove, he tuned his radio to a country music station and settled in for the long haul. About an hour into his drive, Jack noticed something strange. The highway seemed unusually empty, even for this time of night. There were no other vehicles, no distant headlights, nothing. Just an endless stretch of asphalt and the quiet hum of his truck's engine. Jack shrugged off the eerie emptiness and continued driving. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white dress, her long hair blowing in the wind. She stood motionless, staring at him as he approached. Jack slowed down and pulled over. He rolled down his window and called out, "Are you all right, Ma? I am. Do you need a ride?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned and started walking down the highway, away from his truck. Jack felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't just leave her there. He decided to follow her. He drove slowly behind her, the headlights casting long shadows on the road. After a few minutes, the woman stopped and looked back at him. Her eyes were hollow, and her expression was one of deep sadness. She raised her hand and pointed down the highway, then disappeared into thin air. Shaken, Jack continued down the highway. The radio began to crackle, and strange, otherworldly voices filled the cab. He tried to change the station, but the voices persisted, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly, Jack saw headlights in his rearview mirror. He sighed in relief, thinking it was another trucker. But as the vehicle got closer, he realized it was an old, beat-up car from the 1950s. It sped past him, its driver's face obscured by shadows. Jack watched the car disappear into the distance, but a few minutes later, it reappeared, coming towards him from the opposite direction. It swerved and vanished just before reaching his truck. Jack's heart raced. He knew something was terribly wrong. Determined to find answers, Jack continued driving. He saw another figure up ahead, this time a woman standing next to a broken-down car. He pulled over and got out of the truck. "Need some help?" he asked, approaching her cautiously. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Thank God you stopped. I've been here for hours. My car just died on me." Jack nodded and inspected the car. It was an old model, like something out of a vintage movie. "What are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" "I was trying to get to the next town," she replied, her voice trembling. But this highway, it's not normal. Jack agreed to give her a ride. As they drove, she introduced herself as Rachel. She explained that she had been driving for hours, but the road seemed to go on forever. "I think we're trapped," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's words echoed in Jack's mind. He had heard of stories about haunted highways, but he never believed them until now. They drove in silence for a while, the atmosphere in the truck growing increasingly tense. Suddenly, the radio crackled again, and a deep, distorted voice spoke, "You must find the key to escape." Jack and Rachel exchanged worried glances. "What key?" Jack muttered. Rachel looked thoughtful. "I've read about places like this. Liminal spaces, places that exist between life and death, reality and the supernatural. Maybe there's something we need to do to break free." Determined to escape, they started looking for clues. Jack remembered the woman in white who had pointed down the highway. "She must have been trying to tell me something," he said. They drove back to the spot where Jack had seen her. There, on the side of the road, was a small, old-fashioned key lying in the dirt. Jack picked it up and examined it. It was made of iron and looked like it belonged to an antique chest. "This has to be it," Rachel said. "But what does it unlock?" As they pondered this, the ghostly car from earlier reappeared, speeding towards them. Jack and Rachel jumped back into the truck just in time. The car passed through them, leaving a chill in its wake. Rachel suddenly had an idea. What if there's a door somewhere on this highway? A door that leads back to the real world. Jack nodded. "It's worth a shot. Let's find it." They drove slowly, scanning the sides of the road for anything unusual. After what felt like hours, they saw an old, decrepit shack hidden among the trees. It looked out of place, like it had been there for centuries. They approached the shack cautiously. Jack tried the door, but it was locked. He pulled out the iron key and inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Inside the shack, they found a large wooden chest. It was covered in dust and cobwebs. Jack used the key to unlock it, and inside they found a collection of old photographs and letters. The images depicted various people, all of whom seemed to be trapped on the highway at different times. Rachel picked up one of the letters and read it aloud. It spoke of a curse placed on the highway by a vengeful spirit, trapping the souls of those who traveled it. The only way to break the curse was to confront the spirit and offer it forgiveness. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and the ghostly figure of a man appeared before them. His eyes were filled with anger and sorrow. "Why are you here?" he demanded. "We want to break the curse," Jack said, stepping forward. "We forgive you." The spirit's expression softened. "I was wronged in life, and my anger has kept me here. But your forgiveness, it sets me free." With a final, mournful look, the spirit vanished, and the shack began to crumble. Jack and Rachel ran outside just as the building collapsed. As they stood there, catching their breath, the fog lifted, and the highway seemed to return to normal. They got back into the truck and drove, this time seeing familiar landmarks and signs of civilization. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the next town. They pulled into a diner's parking lot, and Jack turned to Rachel. "We made it." Rachel smiled, tears of relief in her eyes. "We did." They shared their story with the diner's patrons, who listened in awe. Jack and Rachel knew they had been through something extraordinary, an experience that would bind them together forever. As they parted ways, they promised to keep in touch. The phantom highway was behind them, but the memory of that night would always linger, a reminder of the thin line between our world and the next. Sarah was a diligent young professional, always eager to find ways to optimize her daily routines. One evening, exhausted from a particularly grueling day at work, she decided to take an unfamiliar shortcut to avoid the bumper-to-bumper traffic on her usual route. She had heard about this shortcut from a colleague who claimed it could shave 20 minutes off her commute. Sarah thought she could use those 20 minutes to relax at home. The shortcut led her down a quiet, winding road flanked by dense trees on both sides. It seemed peaceful at first, the perfect escape from the city's chaos. She tuned her car radio to a local station, hoping to find some relaxing music to accompany her drive. As Sarah drove, she began to notice something strange. The same gas station with its flickering neon sign appeared every few miles. She passed the same dilapidated barn, the same rusting tractor in the field, and the same billboard advertising a diner she never seemed to reach. She glanced at her watch and saw that more time had passed than it should have taken to travel this stretch of road. Her heart began to race as a sense of unease crept over her. She tried to dismiss it, thinking she must be imagining things due to her exhaustion. The car radio started to act up, the music fading in and out, replaced by static. She turned the dial, trying to find a clear station, but all she got was eerie, old-time music interspersed with unsettling whispers. She could make out fragments of words, but they made no sense. The streetlights began to flicker, casting long, distorted shadows across the road. The air seemed to grow colder, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She reached for her phone to call someone, anyone, for help, but there was no signal. Her phone screen showed only static. Sarah continued driving, her grip on the steering wheel tightening as fear took hold. She glanced in her rearview mirror and saw a shadowy figure sitting in the back seat. Her heart pounded in her chest as she whipped around to look, but the back seat was empty. She faced forward again, her breath coming in short gasps. She tried to rationalize what she had seen, telling herself it was a trick of the light, a figment of her tired mind. But deep down, she knew something was very wrong. As she drove, fragments of memories began to surface, memories she had long buried. She saw images of a tragic car accident, the twisted metal, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, and the faces of her parents, their expressions frozen in a mixture of pain and terror. Sarah had been in that car accident years ago, the only survivor. Her parents had died, and she had spent years trying to move on, pushing the memories into the deepest recesses of her mind. But now, it seemed the road was forcing her to confront them. Sarah pulled over to the side of the road, her hands trembling. She needed to think, to figure out what was happening. As she sat there, the old-time music on the radio grew louder, the whispers more insistent. She could almost make out the words now, fragments of a conversation. She closed her eyes and let the memories flood back. The accident had happened on a similar road, late at night. They had been returning from a family gathering, and she had been arguing with her parents. She had been driving, distracted, when the car had veered off the road and crashed into a tree. Tears streamed down her face as the guilt and grief she had suppressed for so long came rushing back. She realized that she had never truly dealt with the pain of losing her parents, and it had trapped her in this endless loop, this eternal commute. Determined to break free, Sarah restarted her car and drove on, focusing on the memories, confronting the emotions she had buried. She spoke aloud to her parents, apologizing for the argument, for not being more careful, for surviving when they hadn't. The road seemed to change as she spoke, the landmarks shifting, the eerie music fading. She saw a figure standing by the roadside, and as she approached, she recognized her mother. The figure smiled sadly, and Sarah felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, soothing and gentle. "It's time to let go, Sarah. We love you, and it's not your fault. You need to forgive yourself." With a final surge of emotion, Sarah felt the weight lift off her shoulders. The road ahead became clear, the landmarks no longer repeating. She drove on, the sense of unease dissipating, replaced by a feeling of peace. The radio now played a soft, comforting tune, and her phone buzzed back to life with a full signal. She realized she was nearing her neighborhood, the familiar streets and houses coming into view. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah felt a sense of closure. She had faced her past, confronted the tragedy that had bound her, and found a way to move forward. The eternal commute was over, and she was free. In the days that followed, Sarah made a point to visit her parents' graves, to talk to them, and to finally grieve properly. She reached out to friends and family, sharing her story and finding support in their understanding. She knew the road would always hold a place in her memory, a reminder of the night she had faced her deepest fears and found a way to heal. But it no longer held her captive. She was free to live her life, to embrace the future with an open heart. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.